Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to review Fingerprints, the origins of crime detection, and the murder case that launched forensic science by Colin Beavan. Now, this book is specifically about fingerprints, but it also touches on a number of other interesting topics. It delves somewhat into the past of the European judicial system, back when it was just, feudal lords deciding whatever their whim was. If they believed someone's story, then they would, be let go or given a fine. And if they didn't believe their story, they could be jailed or executed. And a lot of the time, they weren't even allowed to defend themselves because that's just not how it was. And even after the court systems became into power, the defendants weren't allowed to defend themselves because the reasoning was that they would lie to save their own lives. And if they lied, they would endanger their souls for eternity, which is one of the best arguments I can think of separation of church and state. And of course, they talk about how the courts evolved over time and how eventually defendants were allowed to defend themselves and call witnesses. And eventually the concept of bringing evidence into a case was allowed, and that's where the fingerprints come into effect. Now, the fingerprints actually were first used as identifications very tenuously in the middle of the 19th century. But as the 19th century progressed, people began to realize that there was a desperate need to properly identify people. And the method of the time was essentially taking biometric readings that were very primitive, measuring, arm length and finger length and skull size. And once photography became available, they'd take pictures of people. But people can look very similar to each other. And depending on who's doing the measurements, one guy may think that skulls are more important, and one person may think arms are more important. So you get very inconsistent data. Even the collection of things like scars and tattoos, which you'd think would be somewhat cut and dried, weren't. So that kind of biometric data really failed miserably to address the issue. And the reason they wanted to identify people wasn't necessarily to solve crimes. It was to keep prisoners or keep criminals who had multiple crimes in their past, these long rap sheets, from just using a false name and getting a light sentence because they convinced the court that they were a first-time offender. So that was the real desire here, to identify people. And one of the main people that involved in this whole process was a man named Henry Faulds. And that is really the thrust of this book. Henry Faulds is the man that pulled together a number of disparate concepts, and he did the research, and he dedicated himself. He was a full-time doctor, but he was obsessed with this, and he tried to convince people for years to adopt fingerprinting as a means of reliably identifying people, and then eventually identifying evidence at crime scenes to pin a person to a crime. And the man was never given his due. Time and time again, people passed him over. They ignored him. He had been low-born. He had not been high-born. The social caste system of Britain was such that unless you had the right kind of connections, you weren't going to get very far in the academic world, and Henry Faulds didn't have them. And it actually got so bad that there were actually people that were working against him to try to downplay the information he had provided, even though he had published before other people. They were able to convince the general public and the powers that be that Henry Faulds' contribution to the whole scientific endeavor of fingerprinting was minor at best. And even after fingerprinting had become established, and people were really and thoroughly convinced that fingerprints could identify criminals, get rid of long-term criminals off the street, could help solve crimes, both monetary and murder cases, even after all this happened, he still could not get recognition. And it wasn't until 57 years after his death that the Fingerprinting Society in Britain finally admitted and finally started to care for his grave and include him in the history books as being a man that made a major contribution to the science of fingerprinting. Another thing that happened is that one of the people that came up with the classification system that was used in fingerprinting was an Indian in India. And of course, being an Indian, he did not get full credit for what he contributed to the science either, because the British system of categorizing fingerprints was very poorly designed. It could take as much as 2 hours to find a fingerprint amongst their collection. Whereas with the system created by this Indian, I think it was Hawk was his last name. I can't quite remember. It's Haque, I think, but I'm not sure. But his system would allow you to find that same print in like 5 minutes. So it was a vastly superior system, and it wasn't adopted until it had been co-opted and eventually stolen from him by a British gentleman and put forth as being his. So it's a lot of information about this is like people stealing each other's academic credentials, taking credit for things they didn't do. It was kind of frustrating to read because I've encountered that kind of thing in other scientific fields. And it just breaks my heart when I see it. It would be lovely if people could play fair and equitably and ethically, but they don't. But if you have any interest in fingerprinting, this is a book that you're going to want to read. It was very approachable. It's a fast read. It's not a particularly big book. I think I just read these at work. My nonfiction books I read at work, and I think I read this in like 5 days. So if you enjoy forensic science, if you like fingerprinting, if you find crime dramas intriguing, this is definitely a book that you're going to want to check out.